Colorado Territory, 1873. The wind carried the weight of dust and silence as Grace Josephs stepped down from the stagecoach into the dry heat of Cutter's Pass. She held her head high, even if half of it bore the deep reminder of fire. The scar ran from the corner of her right eye, across her cheek, and down her jaw. It had healed years ago, but the world had not. She saw it in the way people glanced and then looked away, like the man who refused to sit beside her during the ride, like the woman in Denver who had whispered, "Poor thing," before turning her back. She was tired of that. The town wasn't large. A saloon, a general store, a livery, and a church that leaned just slightly to the left. Grace walked straight past the stairs, her boots hitting the boardwalk in firm steps. She was not here to beg for kindness. She was here because this was the only post that would take a schoolteacher who looked like her. The schoolhouse stood at the edge of town, small but solid. The door creaked when she stepped inside. Sunlight streamed through dusty windows, lighting up rows of benches and a blackboard still bearing the name Miss Hattie in faded chalk. Grace dropped her satchel and took a deep breath. This was hers now. She had barely begun to dust off the desk when the door swung open behind her. "You the new schoolmarm?" The voice was low, rough as gravel. She turned to face a man leaning against the doorframe, a rifle slung over one shoulder, his hat tipped back. He looked her straight in the eye, no flinch, no pity. "I am," she replied. "Grace Josephs." He stepped into the room. "Duncan Cole. I got the land just west of town. My brother's girl used to teach here. Real spitfire. Hattie. Maybe you heard of her." "I saw her name," Grace said quietly. "She passed last spring. Diphtheria. I am sorry." He nodded once, then looked around the room. "Kids are rough out here. You sure you are up for it?" "I would not have come if I was not." He looked her over again. Not with judgment, not the way others did. Something steadier. She could feel the question in his eyes, but he did not ask it. Instead, he nodded again. "Well," he said, turning toward the door. "If you need anything wood, water, ask for me. I ride through town most days." "Thank you, Mr. Cole." He paused in the doorway. "It is Duncan." She watched him leave, the swing of his coat, the heavy steps of his boots. It was the first time in weeks someone had looked at her without looking away. That night, Grace sat in her small rented room above the milliner's shop, brushing out her hair as the sun dipped behind the hills. The scar tugged at her skin when she smiled, so she did not smile much anymore. But tonight, she let one rise. The next morning came quick and loud. The children were wilder than she expected. Barefoot boys with straw in their hair and girls whispering behind their slates. One boy, lanky and sharp-eyed, whispered, "She looks like a ghost," when he thought she could not hear. She heard, but she did not flinch. She taught them letters, then numbers, then read them a story about a brave girl who crossed the plains. By noon, silence had replaced the giggles. At the door, a small girl with tangled curls held back as the others ran out. "Miss Josephs," she said, "is your face sore?" Grace knelt. "No, sweetheart. It just looks different." "But it does not hurt." The girl nodded solemnly. "I think you are pretty anyway." Grace closed her eyes for a second. "Thank you." A week passed. Then two. Grace settled in. She walked to the schoolhouse before dawn, chopped her own kindling, and kept to herself. But Duncan always seemed to be around, dropping off firewood, fixing the latch on the door, bringing her a tin of biscuits from his sister-in-law. He never asked questions. He never stared. One afternoon, Grace was walking back from the creek with her washing when two horses burst from the trees, hooves pounding. The first man wore a sheriff's badge. The second was a boy no older than 17, his shirt torn, his face pale with fear. "Get back!" The sheriff barked at her, rifle raised. The boy tripped, fell hard. "I did not steal nothing," he cried. Grace stared, frozen. The sheriff raised his rifle. And then Duncan was there, riding in fast. "Hold up," he shouted, sliding from his saddle. "This boy's a thief," the sheriff snapped. "He is not," Duncan said. "That is Levi. Lives out by the ridge. I know his father. Let the boy speak." The sheriff hesitated. Grace stepped forward, her voice calm. "Let him speak." The boy caught his breath. "My sister's sick. I took a bottle of laudanum from the doctor's sack. I was going to bring it back." Duncan looked at the sheriff. He told the truth. "Let him go." The sheriff lowered his rifle, grumbling. "Next time, tell someone." The men rode off. Duncan turned to Grace. You all right? She nodded slowly, heart still racing. You stepped in, he said. So did you. He looked at her then, really looked. You do not scare easy. I have been through worse. His eyes flicked to the scar. I know. She waited for the pity. But it never came. You know what I see when I look at you? He asked. She held her breath. Courage. Her throat tightened. That is not what most people see. Then most people are fools. She looked away, blinking fast. Duncan reached for her basket, took it from her hands. Let me walk you back. And he did. From that day on, he stayed close. Not too close, but enough. He sat in on lessons sometimes, carved a new chalk tray for her desk, brought her a wildflower in a tin cup, and left it by the window. She never asked for any of it. But she never told him to stop. One late evening, a storm rolled in. The wind howled through Cutter's Pass. Grace's window snapped open. Before she could reach it, the door burst open and Duncan came through, soaked to the bone. Storms tearing through the ridge. Thought you might be scared. She was not. But she let him stay. They sat in silence, sharing a blanket near the stove. He told her about his brother's ranch, about losing his parents young. She told him about the fire that took her home, her family, and left her with this face. It ain't your face that makes you different, he said. It is the way you carry it. The wind died down. But he did not leave. And she did not ask him to. The frost held late that spring, clinging to the ground in silver lace even as the sun climbed. By mid-April, the river thawed only in patches, and the wind still bit through wool. Grace had taken to keeping the stove lit in the schoolhouse through the afternoons, feeding it pine knots Duncan had split without her asking. The mornings came quieter now, with fewer sideways glances from townsfolk and more nods from the children's parents. Mrs. Langtry, whose son had once whispered cruel things behind his slate, now offered Grace a jar of apple preserves with a shy, "You're good with them." Grace accepted with a stiff smile, unsure how to feel about the slow undoing of old judgments. One Thursday, Duncan arrived just as the children scattered home, his coat damp at the shoulders from the sleet that had begun to fall. He leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, watching her erase the board with long, steady strokes. You ever been on a branding crew? He asked. She looked over her shoulder, dry rag in hand. No, you want to come watch? She hesitated. Why? He shrugged. Spring work's coming. It's loud, messy, but there's a rhythm to it. Figured you might like seeing something that doesn't sit still. She wiped chalk dust from her hands. And you'd let a schoolteacher just stand around in the way? I'd hand you a bucket, if you're willing. She studied him for a long moment. All right. The next morning, he met her at the edge of town with a saddled mule and a thick wool coat draped over the saddle horn. Borrowed it from my sister-in-law. You'll freeze without it. The ride out took over an hour. The land opened wide once they left the road, rolling hills still brown with winter. A few early calves bucked near their mothers, long-legged and skittish. The branding pen sat low in a draw, smoke already curling from the fire pit where the irons heated. Men and women moved through the pens with practiced grace, ropes flicking, boots thudding over packed dirt. Duncan dismounted and offered his hand. Grace took it, her boots slipping slightly in the mud. You don't have to stay long, he said. Just thought you might want to see something different. I want to. He handed her a wooden pail. Water. For the men. They'll drink while they're working. She nodded and walked toward the fire. By midday, her hands ached from carrying the pail back and forth. Her hem was soaked and her cheeks flushed from the heat of the iron pit, but she didn't step away. Duncan passed her now and then, his hat low, rope in hand, shoulders tense with effort. Once, as he passed, he touched her elbow lightly as silent check-in. She met his eyes and gave a small nod. She was fine. Later, as the sun dipped low and the crew broke bread on the edge of the draw, she sat beside Duncan on a felled log. He offered her a thick slice of bread and a sliver of hard cheese. They ate without speaking at first, the quiet of shared labor between them. Then he said, You kept pace. I wanted to. Most don't. She glanced at her boots, caked in mud. I've never wanted to be most. He looked at her, then turned his gaze back to the hills. My mother used to say women like that don't last out here. What do you think? I think women like that are the only ones who do. The wind shifted. Smoke from the branding pit blew toward them, sharp and acrid. She coughed once, and he reached for his canteen, offering it without a word. She drank, the water cold and clean. "Why did you bring me today?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. Then, "You've been alone a long time. Thought maybe you'd forgotten what it felt like to be part of something." She stared at the horizon, where the sky had begun to blush pink. "I didn't forget. I just stopped expecting it." He was quiet then. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "That scar don't make you different to me. But you walk like you think it does." Her breath caught. "I don't see shame when I look at you," he went on. "I see someone who lived through something. That matters." She didn't look at him. Not yet. But she whispered, "It's not easy, carrying both what's gone and what's left behind." "I know it." The men began to stir. Someone laughed, deep and rough. A dog barked from the edge of the herd. Grace stood, brushing off her skirt, and Duncan rose beside her. As they walked back to the pens, she said, "Next time, don't hand me a bucket. I want a rope." He grinned, not wide, not loud, but enough. "All right then, Grace Josephs. Next time, you get a rope." That night, she returned to her room with the smell of smoke in her hair and the ache of honest work in her bones. She undid her braids slowly, fingers stiff, and stared at her reflection in the small mirror above the wash basin. The scar was still there, would always be, but for the first time in a long while, it didn't feel like the only thing she saw. By early May, the thaw had taken hold for good. The cottonwoods along the creek unfurled pale green leaves, and the ground softened enough for Duncan to start turning soil for spring planting. Grace walked the mile to the schoolhouse without needing her coat, the hem of her dress brushing against fresh shoots of grass instead of frost. One afternoon, after dismissing the children, she lingered in the yard, watching the boys chase each other with sticks and the girls gather violets near the fence line. A familiar figure rode up along the road from the west, his hat low against the sun. Duncan slowed his horse when he reached the gate, resting his arm on the saddle horn. "You got a moment?" Grace brushed chalk from her skirt. "I do." He dismounted and led the horse by the reins as they walked down the path, away from the children's laughter. He kept his eyes ahead, boots crunching softly over gravel. "My brother's gone to Golden for a week," he said. "Left me to keep an eye on things. I thought might be a good time to show you the orchard. I didn't know you had one." He nodded slightly. "It's tucked behind the last ridge before the canyon. Doesn't look like much now, but it'll bloom in another week or so." Grace followed his pace, hands folded loosely in front of her. "Are you offering to show me trees with bare branches?" He gave a quiet huff through his nose. "I suppose I am." "Then all right." They rode single file through the scrubland, the sun sinking behind their shoulders. Duncan's horse picked its way over dry gullies and narrow trails, and Grace's mule followed without complaint. She kept her gaze on the horizon, where the land tipped upward and the sky stretched wide and tired. They reached the orchard just before dusk. 20 or so trees stood in neat rows, their bark dark against the gold-lit grass. A few had begun to bud white flecks like candle wicks waiting for flame. Duncan tied off the reins and sat down on a low rock between two trees. Grace stood beside him, arms crossed lightly against the breeze. "My mother planted the first 5, he said. Said even this land could grow sweetness if you gave it enough years." She looked around. And it did. Eventually, he reached down and picked up a small stone, turning it over in his palm before setting it aside again. "She used to bring us here when things got loud in the house," he said. "My father, he wasn't cruel, just full of silence that wore everyone down." Grace sat beside him, careful not to let her skirt catch on the rock's rough edge. Sometimes quiet can be crueler than shouting. He nodded once, slow. "I used to think if I just worked hard enough, I'd never turn out like him. But some days, I catch myself falling into the same stillness." She tilted her head. "You don't seem like a man who pushes people away. I didn't used to be. Then Hattie died, and my brother near drank himself into the grave. I stayed to keep things from falling apart." Grace traced a line in the dirt with her boot heel. "I know what it is to lose your place in the world." He turned toward her, eyes steady. "You never say much about what happened to you." She looked out over the orchard. "It was a kitchen fire. I was 19. My father was gone by then. My mother and sister didn't get out." He didn't speak, only waited. "I couldn't go back to that town," she continued. "Folks looked at me like I was a warning, not a person. I traveled east, then west. Took work where I could. Taught in places where no one else would. I thought if I kept moving, it wouldn't follow me. But it did. She gave a short breath. It always does. Duncan reached down and pulled a blade of grass between his fingers, twisting it slow. You never once let it win. She glanced at him. What makes you so sure? Because you're here. Because I've seen what it looks like when someone stops fighting. The sun slipped behind the ridge, the orchard falling into cool shadow. Grace stood, brushing the dust from her hands. I should get back before dark. I'll ride you. They moved in silence for a while, the rhythm of hoofbeats filling the quiet between them. At the edge of town, just before the first lanterns flickered to life in windows, Grace stopped her mule and turned toward him. Why did you bring me out there, really? Duncan adjusted the reins in his hand. Because I wanted to show you something that took years to grow. She watched him for a long moment, then nodded once and turned toward home. That night, she didn't light a candle. She stood at her window in the dark, watching the orchard's silhouette in her memory. For the first time in years, she let herself imagine roots deep, quiet, unseen holding her in place. By the second week of May, the first blooms opened across the hills like hushes of color-pale blue flax, yellow bells, and the soft pink of early prairie roses. The children grew restless in the schoolhouse, their eyes drifting toward windows and the world beyond letters. Grace gave them more time outdoors, letting their knees stain with clover and their hands smell of dirt. One afternoon, after the room had emptied and the last chalkboard sums had been wiped clean, Duncan appeared at the door, one shoulder braced against the frame. His hat was off, hooked through 2 fingers, and his hair hung damp with sweat near the temples. I need someone to read something, he said. Can't make heads or tails of it. Grace looked up from her papers. What is it? Letter from my sister in Golden. She writes in a hand only the Lord and schoolteachers can understand. She set her pencil aside. Let's see it. They sat on the bench beneath the window, the letter creased and smudged from his pocket. Grace read it aloud, slow and clear, the language neat and domestic news of a new baby, a neighbor's runaway cow, a mention of a dress pattern sent by rail. When she finished, he tapped the corner of the page. That part there, what's she mean by pattern number 37 with pleats? A dress style. For sewing. He nodded once, then looked at her sidelong. You know how to sew? I used to. My mother taught me. You ever think of making something for yourself now? She folded the letter carefully. I never saw the point. Duncan leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Maybe it's not always about need. Sometimes it's about doing something just because it's yours. She studied the curve of his back, the way the light caught the edge of his jaw. You always talk like that. He gave a small shrug. Only when I mean it. A breeze pushed through the window, lifting the edge of her sleeve. She pressed the letter flat against the desk. You're not like the men I've known, she said. He didn't look away. You're not like the women I've known, either. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling a shutter that had worked loose. Grace stood and reached for the latch, but Duncan was already there, steadying it with one hand while securing the hinge with the other. She watched the set of his mouth, the scar on his knuckle, the way he checked the hinge twice before stepping back. You fix things without being asked, she said. I reckon that's better than waiting for someone to need it. She didn't answer. He turned to face her, the space between them small, filled with dust motes and warm air. I've been thinking, he said, about what you said, not expecting to belong. Her breath caught. Yes. I figure maybe you don't have to expect it. Maybe you just let it happen. One rooted thing at a time. Grace looked at him then. Really looked. The slope of his shoulders, the steadiness in how he held himself, not pressed or hesitant, just there, like something meant to be leaned on. What are you offering, Duncan? He stepped closer. A place that stays. A table with 2 chairs. A door that opens when you come home. Not out of charity. Not because I pity you. She met his eyes, voice low. Then why? Because every day I see you, I know more of who I am. And I want to keep knowing. The silence stretched between them, not empty but full. She reached up, gently touched the edge of his collar, her fingers brushing the worn fabric. I don't know how to be someone's beginning. I've only ever been what's left after. He lifted her hand between his, rough palms cupping her fingers. You're not what's left. You're what's next. Her throat tightened, but she didn't look away. I don't want to disappear into someone else's life. Then let's make one that's ours. He kissed her then, soft and certain, The kind of kiss that didn't ask for anything more than what it was, a promise made solid in the quiet. She didn't pull back. When they parted, the shutter outside rattled again. He reached for her hand. "Come see the ridge tomorrow," he said. "There's wild plums blooming. I thought maybe we could start planning where to build." She nodded, her voice steady. "I'd like that." They left the schoolhouse together, their shadows long on the dirt road, walking side by side into the gold of late afternoon. And this time, she didn't walk like someone carrying what had been taken. She walked like someone choosing what came next. The ridge sat high and quiet, just past a break in the hills where the wind came gentler and the soil ran dark. Grace walked beside Duncan, her boots sinking into patches of moss softened by the spring rains. He carried a small axe and a rolled linen sack slung over one shoulder, the handle of a hand shovel sticking out the top. He stopped at an open rise nestled between two low swells of land. Plums hung in pale clusters, the blossoms gone to fruit, early and green. The trees curved naturally, forming a half ring around a flat stretch that caught the morning sun. "Here," Duncan said, glancing up at the sky. "The light stays longer. Wind's quiet. Creek's close enough for water, but not so close it'll flood." Grace crouched to run her hand over the ground. The grass was soft and fine. "It feels like a place that could hold something." "That's what I thought." He unrolled the linen sack, revealing a folded sheaf of papers. Lines drawn by hand measurements, sketches, an outline of a small house with a covered porch and a chimney set along the west wall. "I started drawing this back in February," he said. "Didn't know who it was for then. Just felt like something I wanted to build." She took the pages, tracing a finger over the pencil lines. "One room. At first. Add on as we need. I figured a root cellar, a small barn. Maybe a second room later, if we find reason." Grace looked up at him. "And do you think we have reason now?" He didn't hesitate. "I do." She folded the plans carefully and set them back in the sack. "Then let's start with the foundation." They worked together for the next week, clearing stones, marking corners with string and stakes. Duncan borrowed a wagon from his brother to haul lumber from town. Grace sorted nails by size and sanded the rough edges from the floorboards. She wore a straw hat Duncan's brother's wife had given her, and when the sun beat down too hard, Duncan strung canvas between two trees to cast shade over where she worked. On the fifth evening, they sat on a log under the high moonlight, their hands stained with sap and dust. Duncan leaned back and looked toward the skeleton of the house, the frame now rising, rafters set, the shape of a life beginning to show. "You ever think about what comes after?" he asked. She rested her chin on her knees. "I used to think all I'd have would be a room somewhere above someone else's life. Now I think about shelves for books, a chair that's mine, a kettle that whistles." He nodded once. "I think about mornings. You pouring coffee while I check the fence line. Supper on the porch. The smell of cut hay in July." Grace turned to him. "And if I told you I want those things too? That I've stopped waiting for the scar to be what people see first?" His voice was quiet, certain. "Then I'd say I'm ready." They married the next Sunday, standing beneath the cottonwood outside the schoolhouse. The preacher from the next town over came by wagon, his wife holding the book of prayers. There were no flowers, just the wind in the trees and the smell of warming earth. The children sat on the front steps, dressed in their Sunday best, and one of the girls brought Grace a bundle of sage tied with string. Duncan wore his only black coat, his boots polished, the line of his jaw freshly shaved. Grace wore a simple blue dress, the one she'd sewn the week before, the pleats falling just right. Her hair, for the first time in years, was unbound and braided with a ribbon Duncan had found in his mother's old trunk. When they spoke their vows, Duncan took her hands and looked at her without blinking. "I will build beside you," he said. "Whatever comes, whatever stays." Grace answered with steady eyes. "And I will walk with you. Not behind, not ahead. With." Afterward, they shared bread and coffee beneath the tree. The townsfolk lingered, offering small gifts, a sack of beans, a carved spoon, a patch quilt. No one looked away from Grace. No one whispered. That night, they returned to the ridge. The house still lacked doors and windows, but the roof held, and the chimney stood ready. Duncan lit a fire in the hearth, the smoke curling steady into the night. Grace laid out the quilt on the floorboards, and they sat side by side, watching the flames dance. He reached for her hand and kissed the inside of her wrist. "You sure this is what you want?" She leaned her head against his shoulder. It's the first thing I've wanted that didn't come from running. He wrapped his arm around her and pulled her close. They lay there as the fire burned low, the wind outside soft as breath. Seasons passed. The house filled first with shelves of books and pots of herbs, then with the quiet echo of shared laughter. Duncan built the barn come August, and Grace planted a row of carrots behind the orchard. Each morning, she watched the sun rise through the east window he carved just for her, and each night, they sat on the porch until the stars came. By the second winter, they added the second room. Not out of need, but because they could. Grace taught the children through the warm months and wrote letters for neighbors in the cold. Duncan rode the ridge fence, repaired tools, brought her wild plums when they ripened. They never spoke of what had come before, not because they forgot, but because they didn't need to hold it up between them anymore. And when Grace looked in the mirror, she still saw the mark that fire had left. But it no longer felt like something broken. It felt like something healed.